I'm Herb Gale, the Associate Secretary for Planned Giving for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And I'm with Nancy Harvey from Summerside Presbyterian and Doug Schomburg, minister at Chippewa Presbyterian, which is near Niagara Falls, Ontario. Thanks so much to the two of you for participating in this chat about capital campaigns.
We wanted to do some renovations to our existing building. And during the process of investigating, we found out that there were structural problems with the building. And in further research, determined that the cost of repair would be much more than what we wanted to spend on the building. And then we began to investigate the possibility of reconstructing.
We had about a 1960s A-frame sanctuary and a Christian education building that was built in in the early 1970s. What we were finding is that we were not handicapped accessible. We had issues for entry into the building, a lot of safety concerns. We didn't have access to our lower level elevator access. And so we had a lot of piecemeal projects that we wanted to address, but every time you started to address one, it opened up a Pandora's box of other issues that also needed to be addressed. And then we realized we need to go whole hog and really try and address everything at once.
So it sounds like for both of you, it was a fairly lengthy process to get to the point where you realized the need for a capital campaign.
What was happening is at our Board of Managers meetings, we'd have a conversation about handicap access to the entrance to the building. And we would get quotes on that and realize that if we did that, then we'd have 3 other projects that also needed to happen, and stuff would get tabled. We need an elevator to our lower hall. We'd explore the work that would need to be done for that, realized it would open up another 3 or 4 projects. And so we'd end up tabling that. And so after doing this a number of times, we decided to create a strategic planning team to look at not just the facility itself, but our ministry perspective going forward, and took the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation, almost like a wish list. You know, in an ideal world, if we could solve every problem with this facility and could engage ministry in this community in any way we wanted, what would that be? And that was a long conversation as well.
In 2003, when we celebrated our 150th anniversary, that was the time when we wanted to, or came forward with the idea of doing renovations to our sanctuary. And by 2005, we had started to get quotes on what we wanted to do, and that was when we determined, or it was determined, that we had structural problems and needed to look further. By 2007, we had made the decision to rebuild rather than renovate. And by 2008, we began a capital campaign. And in 2011, we finally built the church.
Okay,
so
yeah.
It was quite a long process for us.
Yes, it was. Okay. Which, by the way, I visited a lot of congregations, and that's not unusual. It often takes sometimes decades to reach the point where you're really ready to move forward. So I just think it's helpful for other congregations to realize that you just don't decide one day, well, we'll do this. Yeah. It tends to be a very lengthy process, and I think that's necessary.
Jump in, Herb. Our timeline very, very similar to Summerside's. It was 2005 that we created the strategic planning team. 2007 that we finally worked with an architect and got requests for proposals. We didn't do our capital campaign until 2008. We didn't break ground until 2010. Probably the biggest obstacle was my own anxiety and the anxiety of the leadership of the church. When you start talking about 6 figures, in addition to your regular budget, when last year, you sort of struggled along to get to the end of December, to start talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars is very, very scary. And so when I'm anxious, I tend to back away. So the biggest obstacle, I would say, was my sort of internal leadership to move forward with this. But I found homework eased anxiety. The more reading I did, the more people I talked to, the more I learned, the more I realized that, yeah, churches do this, and it can be done. But having homework done all the way along, because if I'm anxious first, I know that the congregation's also going to be as equally anxious. And so I would say dealing with that anxiety was always the biggest barrier. Can we do this? What if we can't raise the money? What if? And I learned to get really good at answering what if questions.
One of the major learnings that I had was the realization that this was not just about raising money or the bricks and mortar of a new facility, but that something really wonderful happened to the life and ministry of the congregation in that process. We were really raising and growing the faith of the congregation and expanding our ministry.
One of the key learnings we had through the process was the reminder that people give to people. People don't give to buildings or mortgages. And so we worked really hard to encapsulate and articulate why we were working so hard to change the facility. And so it became about individual stories. It's not just an elevator to the lower hall. It's one of our members, Doug, being able to come to a church dinner in his wheelchair and join us for a Christmas dinner. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just a nursery, it was Elsa and her mom being comfortable coming to church, knowing that, their child, for the parents, that the child is in a bright, well cared for nursery. And so it wasn't a nursery, it was Elsa. And so our campaign became we entitled it Opening the Doors. And it created a culture shift for the congregation, which is who isn't here that could be here if we changed this facility, and it translated not just to the facility, but to our ministries as well. What barriers do we have in place that are preventing people from hearing the gospel, meeting Jesus Christ, coming to worship, and it translated into all areas of our work. It was beautiful, actually.
I'm smiling as you tell that story, because I remember at Westminster St. Paul's, we weren't accessible either. And I remember one conversation in which an elder was saying, well, why do we need this? We don't have any people with wheelchairs around here. Well, there's a good reason why. They couldn't get into the facility. Exactly. So it did change our attitude toward how can we be accessible to the larger community.
I would describe it as a community building project and a faith building project for us, as well as an actual physical building. And we found too, in addition to what Doug said about people giving to people, we found as well that people were willing to give to projects if they were passionate about the project. Because during our process, we had a couple of times when we were going to have to make changes, notably to leave off a steeple, which had been part of the original design, and also to not move the pipe organ, which was in our original building, because of costs. And in both of those instances, people who were passionate about those projects took on an additional campaign to raise funds, and both were successful. So that was it was an eye-opening experience for us, and it was also very uplifting.
Doug, I understand that you had a biblical passage that really kind of led the way for you as a congregation. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Interestingly, the congregation's logo at that time was a compilation of 4 individuals, and the shape of them created a cross in the center. And we realized that unintentionally, that logo reflected the four friends of the gospel story in Mark 2, those four friends that ripped the roof off of the home so that they could get their paralyzed friend down in front of Jesus. And for us, that was an epiphany of sorts. It's like, well, that's exactly the kind of people, first of all, that we want to be. We want to be like those four friends who would do whatever it takes to get somebody in front of Jesus so that he could speak his words of healing and restoration and forgiveness. And so that became a touchstone for us. That was already our identity. It was already our logo. So we really lifted that up and held that up. And then used that Mark 2 story and the phrase opening the doors and the parallels of opening the roof to explain to the church, this is our core identity. This is who we want to be, the kind of people who will go to the nth degree in order to get people in front of Jesus so he can talk to them and minister to them and meet with them and see their lives changed and leave walking, so to speak.
We didn't have such an interesting theological story to share, but what we did have was we chose the theme, faith in the future, and we built everything around that, our campaign, and we had a wonderful gift given to us by our organist and a friend of hers who wrote a song for our campaign. And in many instances, that is what got us through. And if I may just read you a couple of lines from that song, it says, "We join in welcoming the days ahead, for God's providing us with all we need. God's love is guiding us, our futures strong and bright. With faith in God, we will succeed." And the more times we sang that, the more we began to believe it.
I think both congregations use the services of an outside professional. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Looking back on that, was that a wise decision? Would you do that again? And what value did they bring to that process?
In the same way that we would never presume to draw up our own architectural plans, we didn't have that knowledge. We realized that to raise that large an amount of money, it was going to have to be something different than what we'd always done. And what the consultant brought to us was a model and a framework and a way of thinking, as well as a program that we were able to then just enter into. And rather than try and reinvent the wheel or spend a lot of energy and resources for a less than ideal result, work with somebody with a proven track record who could teach and coach us through that process.
They were able to tell us almost exactly what was an achievable goal for us to set as a campaign goal. And that was amazing to us. I don't know yet how they figured that out, but and then in helping us to reach that goal, they divided the gifts into levels, 3 different levels of giving, and showed us how that would be useful in helping to determine the ask of people when we were visiting them. And so I guess for us, it was, they made it realistic and they made it doable for us. And they also provided us with the print materials, which were really good and which we would not have been able to do on our own.
Did you do any kind of feasibility study with your project, Doug?
The consultant was able to articulate for us sort of expected goals. And even just learning what that was and what they were and sort of what the long-term implications of that, again, very empowering, very helpful, reduced our anxiety a great deal because we had an informed, realistic picture of what we could expect to achieve. And he was very accurate.
And certainly that was my experience at Westminster St. Paul's in Guelph. Without that feasibility study, we really didn't have a clue about what we were capable of raising. And by having that kind of realistic target, we had the confidence to move forward, but also, in effect, it silenced those within the congregation who said, you can't do this. Because here an outside voice with helpful experience and training said, no, you can realistically expect to raise this amount of money. It was very helpful for us. Obviously, we're not all in the same financial situation to support a project at the same level. So it sounds like you were inviting people to consider different size gifts when you visited with them. Is that correct?
That is correct. There was the top level was called groundbreaking gifts, which ranged from $15,000 to $100,000. So there was a huge range within each level, but there were three levels: cornerstone gifts from $5,000 to $10,000, and then fellowship gifts, gifts of $1,000 and less even,
okay.
and up to $2,500. And another thing that we did, we kind of broke that down for people to figure out how much that would be per week if they were in a certain level, like if they chose a certain gift, so that it was more realistic for them to figure out if it was doable for them.
Yeah, we again with our consultant's guidance, we had a chart, a commitment card that mapped out very similar to what Nancy just described there in terms of weekly, monthly, yearly size of gifts, categories of gifts. But the undergirding that the consultant, a phrase he provided to us, which again, very helpful, was not equal gifts, but equal sacrifice. And again, that's a recognition that the resources available to people in the congregation are vastly different, all the way from fixed incomes to business people with a great deal of resource behind them. So the phrase not equal gifts but equal sacrifice touched into the fact that we're looking to all feel pinched in the same way when it comes to our gift, as opposed to 100 people all giving an equal amount or things like that, because that's not realistic based on the circumstances of people in the church.
One thing I'd like to do now is to put on my planned giving hat, since that's the role I have for the national church. Planned gifts coming from gifts of assets, but I call that second pocket rather than from our current income.
When you speak about planned gifts, planned gifts, we had a bequest that had been given to our congregation many years before, not many, but several years before. And when a family had died, they left their money or a good portion of money to our congregation. And it was always kept and just used the interest on. And when it was time for us to begin this building process, the congregation made the decision to use that money as part of our building fund. And it provided us with almost an equal amount to the goal that we were trying to fundraise. So for us, of course, that was a huge gift as well. And someone who never knew we would be needing to build a new church made that possible for us.
Yes. So really a previous generation was helping in part of the campaign itself.
Indeed, yes, very much so.
Doug, how about the situation at Chippewa? Did you experience something similar there?
Yeah, we did have a number of people who gave through the donation of their securities. We did use the national church's, I don't know what to call it, pathway in order to do so, which was very, very helpful to us.
The Planned Giving Office has transfer forms that you can give to members of the congregation who would like to transfer a stock, mutual fund, a bond to the to the church for these kind of purposes. Most congregations don't have their own stockbroker, but you can use the services of the Presbyterian Church in Canada stockbroker. Our policy is to sell those securities as soon as they're in their hand and to direct them to wherever you've indicated that you would like for them to go. It's been a few years now since the projects have been completed. I'm wondering just how this has impacted givings through the offering plate for the annual operating budget.
I think what that certainly was a major concern when we started the fundraising process, and I think I'm safe in saying that from our experience, while the fundraising campaign was ongoing, it did not, in fact, affect the general operating budget to any great extent. However, now our givings for many people were pledged over 5 years, and that term is completed now. We began in 2008, and we actually are finding more challenge now with the general operating fund than we did during the time when we were involved in the actual building campaign. That's not a new story for us, and probably not for many congregations, but it's an ongoing challenge. But I think that the fears of those people who felt that it would have a serious impact on our budget while we were doing the fundraising, I think those fears were allayed in that that really didn't happen.
One thing during the capital campaign was there was a continual emphasis that the giving to the capital campaign would be over and above regular givings. So very clear from the outset that we weren't looking for people to just change the line on their offering envelope and take it out of the general fund and put it into a capital campaign. So very, very clear teaching about that through the campaign. I think almost ironically, all of the conversations about sacrifice and giving and ministry, I think actually had a positive impact on giving to the general budget as well. It raised awareness of our ministries. It raised awareness of the people that we were trying to reach. So in some ways, I think it solidified the annual budget.
Just one last question. As you look back on both this conversation and the projects and process you've been through, has there been one learning that has been significant for you personally coming out of that whole process?
I would go back to what I was saying earlier. Anxiety is your enemy. Homework is your friend. And God wants to do work through God's people. You know, God's eager to get in there and make a difference in your community. And with so taking that courage, you know, the Joshua 1 courage, be strong and courageous. I think for me personally, that was a learning, but it was also a learning for our congregation. And as we enter into different ministries now, or new ideas, or you know, that old Presbyterian phrase, we've never done that before, that's off the table now, because it's like, if we can do that capital campaign, we can do anything. So the question isn't can we anymore, the question is should we, is this what God is calling of us? And so that has shifted the ministry of the church in a very positive way.
For me personally, I think I would say that it is with faith in God we will succeed, and to trust God's timing.